Okay, the title of my presentation is the same. It's Rethinking Venezuelanness through Disenchantment, Exile, and National Identity in Eduardo Sánchez Rugeles, Los Desterrados. Eduardo Sánchez Rugeles has lived in Madrid since 2007, and in the last 5 years, he has attracted the attention of readers and literary critics and has gained popularity in Venezuela and beyond its borders. This popularity is explained in part by the solid support of his Venezuelan publishing houses and by the influence resulting from the literary recognition of his novels, but also by the fact that his texts speak to a generation of readers who recognize themselves in the uses of Venezuelanismos and in the allusions to the Venezuelan popular media culture from the 80s and 90s. Sánchez Rugeles' literary production currently consists of a crime novel, Exile, published in 2013, and a trilogy comprised of his novels, Blue Label Etiqueta Azul of 2010, Transylvania Unplugged 2011, and Ljubljana 2012. In spite of his differences, this novel shares the same proposition, an original topic that brings together a rupture with the trend of the so-called Venezuelanness fiction, alongside the contemporary experiences of Venezuelan exile and displacement. By exploring his character experiences of youth and adulthood, his narrative managed to penetrate the conflictive reality of a part of the almost inexistent middle-class population of Caracas. Such characters and the social class they represent express their disagreement with the symbols of identity that seek to impose on them their sense of national belonging by means of institutional discourses as well as through collective recognition that are forged through everyday bonding. It is, however, the compilation of chronicles entitled Los Desterrados of 2011, which were previously published in the site Relecturas, the book that more directly criticizes these symbols of identity and the one that better confronts the Venezuelan readership with the experiences of those who live the identity conflict from the position of the exiled. In the context of these ideas in this presentation, I seek to explore some of these chronicles to reflect on disenchantment as one of the experiences that define the failure of the Venezuelan nation project. And I mean here the democratic as well as the revolutionary project, both of which were constructed under the spell of the magical state. Disenchantment in Los Desterrados does not acknowledge the utopian possibility of redemption, but instead recognize its mental and ideological imprisonment at the hands of the Bolivarian Revolution. With reference to the chronicles that give shape to Los Desterrados, I approach disenchantment as an expression of dissidence that works through the desacralization of the national tales, as well as through the ideas that the representations of banishment and exile in contemporary Venezuela are an expression of the irreversibility of the myth of national unity. Los Desterrados is a group of texts, the main character and writer of which is Laudaro Sans, a character who, by way of alter ego, was created by Sánchez Rugeles to express with determination the disenchantment of being Venezuelan in the 21st century. Laudaro's ironic and irreverent tone performs a way to writing bound to banishment, not only from the country, but particularly from the boundaries of the national imaginary. This is a writing that, imbued with records of the Venezuelan media culture of the last decades, demands of us the redefinition of the myth and fictions about the Venezuelan being, vis-à-vis the failure of the happiness and prosperity that were promised. These ideas are part of the introduction written by Luis Islas for Los Desterrados, in which he sets up the framework that contextualizes Laudaro Sans' life and political position, while simultaneously acknowledging displacement and exile as one of the subjects of contemporary Venezuelan literature. Even if Islas lucidly suggests the idea that in these chronicles the nation is also endured from a transnational and desacralized cartography, in my reading I propose instead that these characters make of the disenchantment and of the incapability of commitment to their nation their life compass in the exile. Let's take an example. Los Desterrados begins with a chronicle that describes the unexpected encounter in the Madrid-Barajas airport of two characters, Laudaro Sans, who is a Venezuelan writer, an exiled subject, and also a former high school teacher, and one of his ex-students, Felipe Garmendia, who was just emigrating from Venezuela. This text, which is entitled El Desarraigo Imposible, gathers together the commonplace uttered by those who deny their homeland, clichés that are also offensive for the most patriotic followers of the country's nationalistic discourse. However stereotypical, it is through these curses against the origins uttered by the young Felipe that this text recovers and interrogates the conflicted dilemma of belonging to the national imaginary, of rootedness, in the crisis of which is recognized the failure of its institutions. Thus, while waiting for the flights that will take them to their final destinations, the didactic scene unfolds, one in which a young Felipe, full of hate, pain, and confusion, spits out his arguments. And in the midst of the effort to move away from the nation and its signifiers, restores the emptiness and solitude faced by those who take the risk of drawing apart from its charms. And I quote Felipe: "Yo, profesor, se lo digo honestamente, tengo más de un año promoviendo el exilio. Persona con la que hablo que me comenta que tiene ganas de irse, le digo, lárgate, vete de esta mierda, esto no vale nada. Sin embargo, dentro de mi espontaneidad apátrida no puedo evitar un sentimiento de culpa, una incomodidad ante el desarraigo, una especie de pesar por reconocer que una de las cosas más ridículas que he visto en mi vida es al tal Dudamel tocar pajarillo con arreglo sinfónico. Usted, que siempre tuvo las respuestas, dígame, ¿cómo se puede sentir afecto por nuestra cultura de la mediocridad y la muerte?" End of quote. To Felipe's orphan outburst, Laudaro Sans reacts from the position of the one who has lost the magic that brings together the national subjects. Therefore, his response carries a warning that foretells what waits to be discovered in these chronicles, as well as in Exile, that is, the awareness that there is no possible utopia, and that the individuality and solitude that accompanies these experiences of banishment have defeated the fictions that gather together the national community. And I quote Lautaro: "Sabe, Felipe, creo que si no tuviera tanto tiempo fuera de Venezuela no te diría lo que te diré ahora. Al final, las cosas que se echan de menos no resultan visibles. Creo que tiene que ver con el arraigo. Es algo impalpable, telúrico. Puede que haya cierta poesía en el despropósito, en lo mal hecho, en lo incompleto. Creo que la falta de nobleza es la que nos permite reconocerlo, la que nos da cierta identidad. Esa desconfianza, esa visión paupérrima de la vida cotidiana, en el fondo, puede ser nuestro mayor atributo, pero eso es algo que solo puede verse desde lejos. Estando inmersos en el caos, solo se percibe la vulgaridad y la miseria." End of quote. When la falta de nobleza becomes a source of rootedness, or in other words, to make la desconfianza the expression of the bond that brings together the Venezuelan people, is an oxymoron that defies the rootedness and magnificence that have sentenced the representation of Venezuelanness to the adoration of their national idols and to the praise of the congeniality of their people. Moreover, this oxymoron emphasizes the collapse of the representation that aimed to perpetuate the fiction of a national community merged through the myth of the Venezuelan as a happy people. Laudaro Sans and the other characters of this chronicle speak from a position that represents the joining place of this estrangement and the memories of Venezuela over the years, calling into question the certainties of national identity fictions, and expressing contempt for national figures and icons as an expression of the discursive nature of identity representation. But it especially rationalizes and secularizes the magical legacy of the Venezuelan petrostate, which has been recycled in the socialist and totalitarian utopia of Hugo Chavez and his revolution. Lautaro is a wandering subject. A panoramic view of the chronicles that make up Los Desterrados offers the image of a subject in perpetual movement that inhabits multiple places and realities. In his journey, he gathers losses, experiences, and knowledge. in which friendship and emotions are the devices that trigger what Svetlana Boym has called reflected nostalgia, and Raquel talked about this yesterday also. That is, the individual memory that understands that the recovering of signals and shattered pieces of memory does not mean the restoration of the lost home. Such nostalgia dwells in longing and loss. It does not reside in the evocation of national past and future, because it is about individual and collective memory. And although these may overlap in their references, they do not coincide in their narrative and plots of identity. The experiences recorded in Los Desterrados make private memories the basis of their character's identity in the exile. But these texts also satirize the national heroes of Venezuela, and in their accounts transgress the nation's cultural icons. Because for Laudaro and the characters in these chronicles, such symbols have lost the redemptive meaning that historical memory offers to explain the present. This is the fate of Simón Bolívar in the text La Conspiración, in which the discovery of a secret archive that supposedly revealed the homosexual relationship of Andrés Bello and El Libertador causes the intervention of the government in the departments of literary studies, in bookstores, in the Ministerio de Cultura. Thus, in a conversation held between Laudaro and Immanuel Barreto, the mystery hidden behind the government censorship operation is disclosed. And I quote, ¿qué es? Pregunté alzando los hombros. Es la correspondencia erótica que mantuvieron Bolívar y Bello entre 1808 y 1812. El cuento es heavy. Bello era un bichito. La vaina en Inglaterra fue bastante hardcore. El hecho es que en estas malditas cartas se describe con retórica clásica y referentes ilustrados cómo Andrés Bello le reventaba el culo adolescente de Simón. End of quote. In addition to demonstrating the manipulation of the cultural representations and national icons exerted by the state institutions in the restoration of the national memory, this chronicle highlights the importance of sexuality for the construction of national identity in a country where machismo and militarism go hand in hand, and where the body of the nation is incarnate in the untouchable and patriarchal figure of Simón Bolívar. In La Conspiración, homosexuality is conceived by the author as a destabilizing element, as a threat to the national order and the official discourse. However, and despite his critical intention, while trying to demystify the founding fathers of the nation by means of a parody of their presumed homosexuality, Sánchez Rugeles only succeeds in reinforcing homophobia and affirming the meanings of chaos and abnormality imposed on non-normative sexualities. In consequence, by means of this parody, mockery, violence, and hatred against homosexuality are legitimized as proper reactions, and heterosexual desire, identity, and behavior naturalize their normative and regulative power in the national imaginary. Another text, the Email de Jamaica, has better luck in accomplishing this desacralization. In the Email de Jamaica, Sánchez Rugeles rewrites the Carta de Jamaica, not from the perspective of the patriotic writer, but from the position of a displaced subject who evaluates the state of the Venezuelan intelligentsia, the poverty of their citizens, as well as the arbitrariness in which the charm of the revolutionary government is upheld. As it is represented in this text, the arbitrary nature of the Bolivarian revolution reduced the nation to its conception of el pueblo, which is an identification that does not upset fissures and that condemns to alienness those who express dissidence toward its discourses. And I quote, he llegado a pensar que tal venezolanidad no existe. Nuestra gran tara sociológica ha sido querer imponer por la fuerza una manera de ser, unas costumbres homogéneas e incuestionables, una manera común de interpretar el ocio o un estilo de música verdaderamente tradicional. La hibridación cultural ofende a la revolución. El eclecticismo, por lo tanto, ha sido proscrito. El venezolano, según esta gerencia, debe estar orgulloso de ser un individuo unidimensional. End of quote. In his chronicles, Eduardo Sánchez Rugeles suggests that in Venezuela, disenchantment goes hand in hand with the awareness of the failure of the magical state. By way of redefining the Weberian concept, that disenchantment responds to the rationalization of a national utopia and to the desacralization of the enchantment exerted by the Venezuelan magical state, a petrostate that, according to Fernando Coronil, and I quote, came to hold the monopoly of not only of political violence, but of the nation's natural wealth. As such, this petrostate exercised this monopoly dramaturgically, securing compliance through the spectacular display of its imperious presence. The Venezuelan state has been constituted as a unifying force by producing fantasies of collective integration into centralized political institutions. End of quote. This explains why, unlike the Carta de Jamaica, in which Bolivar's ideas were part of his strategies to recruit followers for the cause of the independence, in the Email of Jamaica, the disenchantment imposes itself upon the will to commitment or any sense of responsibility to a new utopia for Lautaro. Hence, to the tara sociológica of querer imponer por la fuerza una manera de hacer, Lautaro replies with a disenchantment in which neither utopias nor alliances are possible any longer, or desirable. In this way, in the origin of this disenchantment dwells the consciousness of the failure of the magical state, but also of its totalitarian reinvention by Hugo Chávez and his Bolivarian revolution. And I quote this email de Jamaica. Dices que deseas entender en principio la cuestión política. La verdad es muy simple, Henry. El llamado chavismo es un proyecto totalitario. Cualquier justificación de este despropósito no es más que mala literatura. Impera en estas tierras un totalitarismo bailable, un bingo incompleto, un absolutismo circense, una raza híbrida de tiranuelos y sicarios. End of quote. According to this logic, the origin and formation, and I'm going to need a little bit more, I'm sorry, but I'll be done soon, I promise. According to this logic, the origin, formation, and popularity of Chavismo as nationalist fundamentalism, as well as the Chavez ritualization in life and his later sanctification by the state and his followers, have been practiced linked to the need to keep alive the rituals, mystery, and magic that have been turned into failure by the magical state. A continuity of such magic found in the mystery of the Venezuelan wealth was resignified by Chavez through the redemptive suprema felicidad social, the magical ingredient which was sought after to keep afloat a repressive and one-dimensional version of the ritual of consensus and national community, controlled by the state and its hegemony over the social, political, cultural, and economical institutions. With respect to the totalitarian utopia denounced by Lautaro, it is relevant to mention the observations that Claudio Magris proposes regarding utopia and disenchantment, for they will help us to understand why an expression of dissidence resides in Lautaro disenchantment. And I quote Magris, "Utopia means not giving in to things as they are and to fight for things as they should be. Utopia and disenchantment, rather than oppose each other, have to hold and correct reciprocally. The end of totalitarian utopias is only liberating if it comes along with the consciousness that the redemption that has been promised and spoiled for those utopias has to be looked at with greatest patience and modesty, knowing that we do not possess any definitive formula, but also without making a mockery of it. The disenchantment that means utopia reinforces its fundamental element, hope, which is not born out of a reassuring and optimistic vision of the world, but of the laceration of the lived and endured unveiled existence, which creates an irrepressible need of rescue. Disenchantment is an ironic, melancholic, and courageous way of hope." End of quote. According to Magris, it is not possible to conceive utopia without disenchantment, nor disenchantment without hope, because the fact of experiences disenchantment means the acknowledgement of finding faith in a failed utopia and in the promise of future happiness. It is also true that hope rests not only in the future, but in the past that has to be scrutinized and mended to make sense of life, not to praise its victories. In the case of Los Desterrados and Laudaro Sans, exile is the end of utopia, and disenchantment is the triumph of the defeat. It is the failure of a nation project, the fissures of which became cracks in the revolution's reappropriation of his narrations. For the character of these chronicles, there is no hope or possible future project, because exile itself becomes the symptom of the failure of the redemptive promises that made by the state, as well as of its wills to mend its mistakes. This impossibility to create a future results in a desacralization of the representation of happiness, which have been used by the official discourse to strengthen the ties of national identity. Happiness relies on hope, Sarah Ame points out, no? On the possibility of an alternative that remains in the future, for hope is a thoughtful way of being directed towards the future, or a way of creating the very thought of the future as going some way. In the absence of hope, in which the utopia is upheld, the myth of happiness collapses, because hope and happiness are oriented towards the anticipation of the future, a future in which the characters of these chronicles do not recognize their own parts. This is the double meaning of disenchantment that we find in these chronicles. Disenchantment as a rationalization of the nation's magical power, and disenchantment as a subjective deception. In these texts, both experiences are inseparable because they give shape to a subject, the exile, the displaced subject, whose truth is irreparably linked to the fracture of the nation, but most of all to the awareness that there is no possible emancipation for such wants. In this way, the tragedy of the exile faces the failure of the democratic utopia in Venezuela, the victory of the one-dimensional thinking. Faced with the memory and the signs of rootedness, which bestow identity on citizens, Lautaro chooses anonymity, detachment, the no belonging. By way of closure and beyond offering concluding remarks, what I have tried to reveal or to express or to explain or read with my approach to Los Desterrados is that it is neither the dialogue nor the utopia nor the promise of redefining the meaning of community that this writer seeks with these chronicles. Rather, he directly acknowledges the awareness of disenchantment as a way to question the normativity that dwells in rootedness, particularly as a language with which articulate the fact that any utopia, in this case democratic or socialist, reveals its failure when the miseries of exile become ingrained in the national imaginary. Thank you.